All right, so we're talking about working with pivot tables today. We've downloaded the university crime data from the blog that we use to manage the class, and I'm opening that starting file. I think I'm opening that starting file. Here we go. All right, so here we have what, like 23,000 rows? Yeah, 23,000 rows of data. And I think it's for spanning years 2006 to 2010. And this is actually data from the crimes known to law enforcement data set. But this is all specifically a subset of that data. This is crimes known to law enforcement that happened on university campuses. And so as we look at this data, we've got a year from the report, the state, the school, the campus of the school. And then we either have a piece of information, the one kind of informational data that we have is enrollment. It's a little bit weird because we've got these crime numbers. Looks like a pretty good campus. Who is this? Auburn University. What do we have? We had 8 counts of larceny known to, these are reported crimes on Auburn campus. That seems like a pretty good year for them. So we've got these 8 different crime categories, but then we also have a category that's enrollment. Kind of thrown in here with the data, which is kind of a weird thing to have, but that's what we've got and that's what we're working with. Okay, so what I'd like to do first, before we start recording, and that's kind of our way into this, is going to be, we'll record ourselves making a pivot table, and then we'll look at that code. And the code that the recorder does for making a pivot table is pretty ugly code. We're going to be able to simplify it dramatically. Kind of once we understand the objects that we're working with when we're working with pivot tables. And so that's where we're headed. But before we start recording, let's just go through the process of building the pivot table that we're going to make once. Let's build it. Then we can throw it away and we can build it again while we're recording. So just a little practice kind of going through it the first time. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the Insert tab and then Pivot Table. I remember the first time I was trying to find where they put the pivot table once they went to this ribbon layout of the menus. I spent like a half hour looking for it because somehow in my mind I thought something more advanced like pivot tables would be off further to the right, like the simple stuff's at the left. And it was right there, but I just never saw it. Anyway, so we're going to say we're going to add a new pivot table. Because I was in the data, it expanded out to that full set of data, and we're going to put on a new sheet. That's fine. All right, and so I think what we'll do is let's go ahead and put the report year as a filter. And then let's put state, school, and campus all as column headers. Oh, no, sorry, as row headers. So state, school, campus. And then I think I'm going to put the label as a column header. And then I'll put the value as the value. So that should give us a reasonable pivot table. So we can kind of look at here. So we're kind of summarizing up to the Alabama level, and we see all of the different schools below Alabama. Those that actually have extra campuses, those are split out there as well. I think I'm also going to say, as we're recording, I'm going to go ahead and collapse the whole, like this whole field. So I'll just like right click this and choose collapse, expand, collapse entire field. And so that'll kind of push us back down to a kind of a simpler table that we could drill into when we want to see the details for a particular state. Okay, so that's the pivot table that we're going to record ourselves making. Any questions before we kind of just jump off and do that? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and delete that sheet, and we'll do that very same process again, but we'll do it recording ourselves. So to my developer tab, turn on my macro recorder. I'm going to call this build pivot table. Control Shift T, I guess. Put in a capital T, and we'll say OK. I'm just going to go through that same process again. I'm just going to make sure I only have one cell selected. If I have multiple cells selected, when it builds the pivot table, it will try to build it on the cells I have selected instead of expanding out. So insert pivot table, and yeah, putting on a new sheet. That looks like the right data set. Excellent. Then I'll go through that same process. I'll put report year as a filter, state, school, and campus, all as row headers. I'll put the label as a column header and then the value as my values. And I'll come up with a sum, which I think is fine. And then the last thing I was going to do was collapse this column. So I'll right click, expand, collapse, and collapse entire field. And we'll stop recording. All right, let's take a look at the code that generated. So Alt F11 and go to my module, should be module 1. This is what we got. Any questions, or do we need to wait to get caught up? Anyone saying I'm almost there? Hold on. Ready to go? You guys are fantastic. All right, so let's take a look at what it recorded. So we've got here range B3.select. I think we don't really have to be selecting B3, so I'm going to get rid of this. Now, as I look at what's happened here, we can see that the pivot table, I told it to put onto a new sheet, so it's adding a sheet. But now you're going to see that as we refer to that sheet that was just got added, it's actually referring to it by whatever name got created there. That's going to be a problem for us, because when we run this again, we want it to create a new pivot table and on whatever sheet it is. And this code is referring to that sheet. So let's be a little more careful about how we are kind of handling the reference to the sheet. So let me go ahead and declare a worksheet variable. I'll just call it S as a worksheet. And then instead of just saying S sheets.add, I'll say S equals sheets.add, or I'm sorry, set S equal to sheets.add. Because when I add a sheet, and I think we've added sheets before, we never said sheets, we said worksheets.add. It turns out that there's 2 kinds of sheets that I can have in my workbook. What are they? I can have a worksheet and what's the other kind of sheet? I can have a chart sheet. I can actually have a chart that's on its own tab. I don't really care for those charts myself, but I guess some people do. It's a normal sheet. So the collection of sheets is all the worksheets and all the chart sheets. So I don't think we've used the sheets collection before. Maybe we have, but that's the difference. So since I'm creating a worksheet, in fact, if you just add something to the sheets collection, it will add a worksheet. So it would have been okay to leave it as sheets. I'm just putting it to the collection that we've used more often. Okay, so now anytime I need to refer to the worksheet that got created, and of course the add sheet method is going to return a reference to the sheet that got created. So now S will be like a shortcut for me to be able to refer to that sheet. So anytime I need to refer to the sheet, I've got the sheet. So in other words, anywhere that it says sheets sheet 2, I could now replace that with S. Very good. Now, we probably don't even really need to select that sheet because it's already selected when I add it. So we'll probably end up deleting that line anyway. But I want to focus on this first one that gets built here because this is a really complex line. And it's actually creating 2 different objects here on this one statement. Okay, so it's saying active workbook, and I'm going to change active workbook to this workbook. Who can tell me the difference between the active workbook and this workbook? Active workbook is whichever workbook happens to be active when this code is running. What is this workbook? Just yell it out. I'm tying my shoe so I don't trip in front of you today. So if you know the answer, yell it out. That's right. This workbook is the code that actually holds, it's the workbook that holds the code that's executing. And so since I'm not anticipating running this code on any workbook besides the one that the code's in, I'm going to change it over to this workbook just because it's a little safer. Now, I can see here that there must be a collection called, that is a property of the workbook called pivot caches. And so here's kind of the first thing that we have to understand now that we're working with pivot tables through code, is that the pivot table is actually not built directly on the data, it's built on a pivot cache. And the pivot cache is what makes the connection to the data. So how many of you have ever made a pivot table off of data that was not stored in Excel? It was stored somewhere else? Well, that's kind of unusual because no one here has done it. So yeah, but we can actually say when we're setting up a pivot table, we could say the connection for this is going to be some database somewhere else. And so what the pivot cache does is it says, regardless of where the data live in Excel, in some other kind of a text file in a database, or some web source, it's going to make the connection to the data, and then it will be the object that manages the data. The pivot table object then is going to be built on a particular pivot cache. So it's kind of a way of saying, listen, there's lots of different places we can get the data. Let's kind of get it into a standard format, an object that knows how to kind of get the data and present it to make a pivot table out of, kind of regardless of where those data are. And then we'll build a pivot table off of that. So what we're saying here is we're going to create a new pivot cache. And we've got these parentheses here, which are all the arguments we're sending to the create statement. So it's going to be an Excel database. It's going to be a data that's sitting here in Excel. The source data has this path here, and then some version 6. Do you have a different version than I have, 6? You probably have 7. That'll be okay. You can leave it as 7. I think it's because what am I running Excel 2009 here, and you're probably on Excel from Office 365 or something. But whether it's version 6 or version 7 should be okay. All right. And so that is creating a new element in the pivot cache, in the pivot cache's collection. So if you were to guess what kind of object this is creating, what would you say it is? What's that? It's not a chart. We're calling the create method of the pivot cache's collection. It's not making the icon either. So this is actually going to be making, and you can kind of think about it, when I say worksheets.add, I'm adding a new element to the worksheets collection. So it's creating a, what does this statement, what kind of object does this statement create? It creates a worksheet. It creates a new one of the things in the collection, that the method that I'm calling the add method for. So here are similar, it's not called that, it's called create, but it's going to create this thing called a pivot cache. You probably have never had reason to even know there was such a thing as a pivot cache before. And so here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to declare a new variable. I'm going to call it PC as a pivot cache. While I'm at it, let me dim PT as a pivot table. Okay, so, and we can see that this must be returning an object. I mean, this is not just creating an object, but it's also returning an object, because at the end of the create, where I can see the parenthesis opens here, and we have the closing parenthesis here, it says it's calling another method. So create pivot table is a method of a pivot cache. So what I want to do is I want to split this. I don't want all this to happen on the same statement. Now that I've got my pivot cache variable here, I am going to set my PC equal to this. So we're going to let this statement run, make the pivot cache, and then say, all right, we've got that object in memory now. I'm going to remember where it is by assigning a variable to its location, binding a variable onto the object. And now, for the next half of this, I'm going to say set PT equal to my PC object, pivot cache object, dot create pivot table. Now, the reason that this create has parentheses around the arguments is because we were doing something with the value it returned. What were we doing? What were we doing with the object that this thing returned? And we were calling a method of it. Now, if we look at the code down here, we're going to see create pivot table. Here's the arguments we're passing to create pivot table, but there's no parentheses. Why? Yeah, we weren't doing anything with the value that came back. It's a really kind of weird thing about VBA, but right, if you're doing something with the value that comes back from a call to a method, you put parentheses around the argument list. If you're not, you don't. And so the reason this is red here is because now we're doing something with what comes back. What are we doing? We're binding the object that gets sent back onto an object variable. And so I have to add the parentheses on this one. They were already there on the one before, and now I'll have to add them on this one. If this were code that I was just writing for myself, I probably would not break this line. I'm kind of comfortable letting the code go off the edge of the screen where I don't see it. But since I want it where you can see it, we'll have that here. Okay. As we're looking at these first two lines, kind of looking at this, is there anything else we want to change about these kind of first two statements that we're dealing with? Creating a pivot cache and creating a pivot table. Go ahead. So when we're creating this pivot, when we're creating the pivot table, here we're actually putting it at to sheet 2. So yeah, let's just go ahead and I think the way I want to do this is just manipulate the string. This could probably take a reference to a range, but I'm not positive about that. So let me just come here and say whatever the name of my sheet is, s.name, and we'll concatenate that on. So I deleted where it said sheet 2. I'm just going to concatenate onto the front of that expression, whatever the name of our sheet is. Excellent. Anything else that you look at this and you say, we probably should change something else here? The table name. Oh, yes. This is going to try to create a pivot table called pivot table 2. In fact, I think what I can do, on the one hand, we might say, I'm going to have to give it, figure out, what's going to be a unique name every time this runs, which will be a little bit difficult. We could do it. But my hunch is if I just delete that and I don't specify the table name, my hunch is that Excel will still create it and it will go ahead and increment and give it a new table name itself. So I think that's something we should do as well. In fact, even if I think we tried to create it with the same name, I think it might still gracefully put a different name on it, although I'm not positive. Anything else that we think we might want to change? I think the whole reason that we're trying to automate the creation of this pivot table is to say, you know what, we might end up with getting more data coming in. In fact, that's the whole purpose of the next project, the database project, is to say, we've got the next year's worth of data. We want to kind of import that data into Excel. And so after that, when I build a pivot table, I'd like it to dynamically figure out what all the data are. And you'll see right now when I create the pivot cache, it is limiting it to a particular range. So and this is kind of old school notation where it specifies the row and column, but it's saying start in row 1, so it's saying row 1, column 1, and end in row 23,164, column 7. So that's the whole set of data. And you'll notice again that this is a string here, but I'm positive that this one can take a reference to a range. Instead of giving it a string, I can actually give it a reference to a range, which would be a little simpler for us to put what we want there. So any thoughts on how we're going to get a range that says, hey, just whatever the full set of data are? Oh, hey, used range. I like it. So here's one approach. We'll probably end up implementing something different, but let's take a look at used range. So let me just, let's just play with this for just a second. So I think if we look here, we can see that my crime data sheet has a code name here of data. I'm going to zoom in on that because this is kind of an important thing to get. So over here, in my list of Excel objects, I'm seeing crime data, which is the one that has my source data on it. Right here where it says data, that's the name that I can refer to this sheet through code. And so I think that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to say data dot used range. And I'll ask for the address. Yeah, first cell to G20, 23,164. That's pretty good. Now, that will work great unless someone comes over here and puts a note. Like they put a note over here that says, remember something. MEMBER. Now my used range is going to go all the way out to J. So used range will be pretty good as long as I've got the discipline to make sure I don't get anything else on this worksheet. So, but I'd like to look at kind of a different approach. So instead of looking at used range, let me go to cells, and then I'm going to show you something about the cells method that we haven't done before. Cells, normally we'd say like 1, 1 would give us the first cell in the worksheet. I'll ask for the address of that, A1. But it turns out you can give a single index to cells, and now it's just that will be the first cell in the whole set of cells. So that will also be A1. What's cell number 2? It's B1. And if we were to go all the way out to the end and then ask what the active cells column is, column. So that's going to be, that'll be row 1, column X, whatever that was. Oh, maybe it won't be. I'm not copied all. 16384. Oh, sorry, because I'm on the used range. I don't want to be on used range. I just want to be on data.cells. Okay, that confused me for just a minute because I want to say data.cells. That should be the last column, XFD1. If I add 1 onto this, 5, it's going to be the next cell. What do you think it's going to be? A2, right? It's going to come right. It's just numbering all the cells 1 through some crazy huge number. Okay. So that's just it's just kind of a different way to refer to cells that I haven't exposed you to yet. But so another way to say range A1 is just cells 1. It's the first cell on the worksheet. And from there, there's actually a method called current region. I think we've been exposed to this already, at least in the textbook. And then we can ask for the address, right? And that's going to give us the set of contiguous data. So we're limited to column G here because I've got a break, right? I've got a blank column separating this data from, the note over here. I'm still in trouble if someone puts a note in column H, but as long as they give themselves a little space, now we're just getting the contiguous data, and I feel a little bit safer about that. And so this will give me a reference to that range that has the contiguous data on it. Now this is worksheets.add. So we've got a new worksheet in here. We're going to set the pivot cache now equal to that expression. And so now if we get more data on the end and we run this, then we should be in pretty good shape. Questions? In the back, go ahead.
So would this cause problems going back to having notes on the far right? Would this cause problems if those notes were up against the side of that table?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question is, if this note in column J was actually in column H, then yeah, current region is going to bring that in. So it's not foolproof, but a little bit better than using used range, because as long as we've got a blank column in here, we'll be safe, for sure.
That we want this current region and not the one in like column J? Could it potentially get just like?
Oh, yeah. So current region, you've got to give it a cell to start with. And then it's going to say, expand that out as far as you can go until you run into a kind of a border that's kind of a blank border to the right and a blank border on the bottom.
But we could put range A1.
No. We could put range A1 here.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, instead of cells. Yeah, this is just another way to get to a particular cell. We hadn't talked about it, and I thought I'd show it. Other questions? Okay, so now we now have an independent reference to the pivot cache and to the pivot table. So yes, I don't think we have to select this sheet, so I'm going to get rid of this line here. I don't think there's any reason to select the cells on the sheet. I'm going to get rid of this as well. And now this whole line here, the truth is, I think this is giving us all the defaults. This is just saying, oh, with that pivot table, we're going to set all this stuff up here. This is the default values. Is it going to have a grand column? Yeah. Is it going to have auto format? Yeah. Whatever all these things are. The truth is, I don't think we need these at all. I'm going to get rid of these because this is just saying, you know, how this whole with end with structure. This is the default way that a pivot table comes in. It just kind of recorded this for me and giving me the code in case I want to modify it. I don't want to modify it. The default's fine. It wouldn't hurt for us to leave this here. We'd want to change the way we're referring to the pivot table, but I think I want to get rid of that just to kind of simplify my code. So that whole long with block, I'm going to get rid of it. Okay, here then is where we are. Okay, not quite yet. We're not quite building the pivot table yet here. We're now actually putting the defaults for the pivot cache. So we built that pivot cache, and it's going to say, are we going to refresh that pivot cache when the file opens? That would make a lot of sense to do if for sure, if it's an external data source, you want to refresh it when the file opens. I'm not entirely sure you'd have to refresh it with local data, but anyway, it's coming up as false, and that's the default. Again, here, it's setting the defaults for the cache. How do I deal with missing items? It's doing the default for that as well. Again, I got rid of the defaults for the pivot table. I'm going to get rid of the defaults for the pivot cache because that's the way they're going to get created anyway with those default values. Okay, so this one looks like, I'm not entirely sure if this is the default or not, but I'm going to go ahead and leave this line in place. Now, right up to here, what is this identifying? Yeah, this is getting me to the particular pivot table. I'm calling the repeat all labels method of the pivot table. Well, our pivot table is not called pivot table 2, and we don't have to try to pick it up by name anyway, because when we created the pivot table, create pivot table, we captured a reference to the table that got created by catching it in my PT variable. So now anytime I've got active sheet pivot tables, pivot table 2, I can just change that to PT. So now this is saying we're going to repeat the labels. That's fine. Now let's look at this one. Okay, so now we're changing 2 properties of a particular pivot field of the pivot table. So again, right to here, that's just referencing the pivot table. I'm going to change that to PT. And so now we're doing something with a particular field, pivot field, the report year field of the pivot table. And what are we saying? What did we make the report year? That was the first thing we did. We made the report year it's the filter. And so that's the orientation of that field is now we're making it what this constant says, the page field. So that's how we set it to be the filter. And we're putting the position as 1. Well, there is only one, we're only going to have one field in the filter. And so I probably don't have to say 1. In fact, probably is going to go in as 1. It couldn't go anywhere besides 1. It's the only one there. So I probably don't need this line. I'm going to get rid of the position. And now it doesn't make any sense for me to have the with clause here because I'm only changing one property. So I'm going to simplify this by just putting this down to pt.fields report year dot orientation is the page, is the filter for the page. Get rid of the end with. So here now, in fact, I may, just to kind of help myself stay oriented to the code here, I may say set the filter. Okay, now as I look at these next 3, I'm seeing I'm adding another pivot table now is going to be a row field. And I'm putting the first one goes in position 1, the next one goes in position 2, the next one goes in position 3. What do you think it's going to go? If I don't tell it what position it's in, what position do you think those are going to go in? They're going to go in 1, 2, 3, just like that. Again, it's kind of the same thing. I don't need the position. And so I'm just going to again, identify my pivot table, bring up the orientation part, and then get rid of the rest of it. And I'll do that for all three of these. And so here I'm setting the row headers. Oh, I thought I had 3 row headers. Did I delete? Did I delete more than I was supposed to? Oh, I missed the first one. Thank you. So I've got my column header there. And then I've already adjusted the one for my column headers. All right, I've got 2 more to go. In this case, what are we doing? We're adding a data field. Okay, so I got the same thing. I'm identifying my pivot table, change that to PT. I'm adding a pivot. Oh, here we are, add data field. And again, another reference to the pivot table here. So I'm going to change that to PT. And if I wanted to change the label here, we could change it. I'm fine with value, with sum of value. Maybe I'll change it to total. And this is going to tell us the sum instead of average. Here, I'm selecting a range. I don't think I need to select a range here. And here's where we're setting the detail to false. So I'll just get my reference to my pivot table there. Whew. Okay, it was a little bit of work to go through, but now we have really dramatically simplified that code. Does it fit all on one screen for me? Not quite. Yeah, actually it does. Whew. That was a lot of work. I wonder if it's gonna work. I'm not entirely sure. I think I called it Control-Shift-T, so I'm gonna come back here, Control-Shift-T. It looks like it generated for me a new pivot table. Yeah, laid it out just the way we're collapsed. We've got California. Yeah, we've got the state, we've got the college, we've got the campus here, all the data laid out. Let's see, somewhere I told it to say total. Yeah, so I think that's where it would have otherwise said sum of value. It says total now here. Okay. So far, so good. How are we feeling about it? 0 to 5, this code so far. Seeing 3s and 4s, a few 5s. Okay, so it looks like you're pretty comfortable. And it's brand new. You shouldn't be totally comfortable with it, but it looks like we're doing okay. However, I think we've got a little issue. Let me come to my control window, my immediate window, and let's look at this workbook. .pivot caches. .count. We've got, right now we've got 2 pivot caches. I'm going to run this thing again. So F5. And run that. And now I've got a new pivot cache. So remember, the pivot cache is like the hub for the data. And my code right now is saying make a new pivot cache for each pivot table. I can build multiple pivot tables off of the same pivot cache And that's probably what I would prefer to do here. And so let's do this. What we're going to do is we're going to check to see if the pivot cache already exists. If there's already a pivot cache in this workbook. If there's a pivot cache in this workbook, I've only got one set of data here. So we're going to assume that it's built on the right data. But the one thing I'm worried about is that if I add more data, it's probably time to build a new pivot cache for it. So I want to take a look and see have I added more data. Okay, so let's come in here and let's build an if statement. So let's say if, so how are we going to know? What do you think? How are we going to know if we should try to use the existing pivot cache or if we should build a new pivot cache? Okay, so first thing would be we're going to be interested in the count, because if there is a pivot table, a pivot cache already, we probably should now investigate the characteristics of it. Okay, I like it. Was there a comment in the back?
That's what I was going to say. I was going to say if it's count greater than 0.
Okay, so if this workbook.pivot caches .count is greater than 0, then let's do this. If it's equal to 0, we know we got to make one. Else if, maybe just else, it'll be 0 or it'll be more than 0. It won't be a negative number in the collection. So this means there's already one created. So we're gonna have to take a look. We may be able to use an existing one, or we may need to build a new one still. Okay. Let's start off by just looking at the first one. We might want to make this a little bit more sophisticated, but let's start off just by looking at that first pivot cache. So if this workbook pivot cache is number 1 dot, and then I think there's like a property called record count. Yeah, record count. If that is equal to, if it's equal to the number of records that I have in my data, well, here's the expression that gets me to my data.cells.current region. Let me just come up here and kind of play with this for a minute. I should be able to say .rows.count. data.cells1.rows.count. And I should be able to ask this workbook pivot cache 1.record count. Okay, so what's the relationship here? Go ahead. That's right. I've got that heading that's going to be in my current region that is not going to be in the rows. So I'm going to have to offset this by 1. Let's see if I can silence my phone. All right, so I want to say if the record count is equal to 1, if the record count plus 1 is equal to the count of the rows of my current region, then we're going to do something else and if. So what are we going to do? I think let's just set PC equal to that first pivot cache. In other words, don't make a new pivot cache, just bind our PC object onto that existing pivot cache. and build the table from there. Questions? Yep.
So will this accept a change within the given data, right? So if we were to go into Auburn University and change the numbers by one, will the pivot cache accept that modification? Or will it new?
Yeah, so the question is, does the pivot, if we were to change the data, for whatever reason, seems like a strange thing to do with this particular data set, but if we were to come in here and say, oh, wait a minute, no, we know better, wasn't really 0 here, this was 6. Is that pivot cache, clearly at this point, if we build a new pivot cache on this data, it's gonna take that number. But for that existing pivot cache, what do we have to do to update it? And the truth is, I don't know the answer to that question, but it wouldn't surprise me if my pivot cache has some kind of a refresh method. Let's just take a quick look. Yeah, there's a refresh method. So we certainly could set the pivot cache to that cache, or set the PC variable to that pivot cache. And if we want to, we could say PC.refresh. And that should tell it to go back and look at the data source and rebuild. Now, if it's not at this point, let's just go ahead and rebuild it. I'm a little uncomfortable with just kind of copying and pasting this data. And I think my real preference would be to kind of think of a better logical flow through this. Maybe we'll go ahead and do that right now. So rather than having 2 ways through this if statement, it's going to take me to the same code. I'd like to have that hit with one code. I just have that code in there once. So I'm trying to think about the way to do it is. So let's do it this way. If it's greater than 0, and this condition is true, it's going to be a really long line, so I'm going to break it into 2 lines. Then it's going to be a little bit better. So that's a really kind of a long if statement here. But we're saying, listen, if there's greater than 1, I think VBA is probably going to check this, even if it's not the case. I don't think VBA is smart enough. It might be now. That might have been an improvement that they've made. It used to be in the early days of VBA that, with this and here, they both have to be true. And so it could check this one, realize it's false, and go, I don't have to check the next one. But VBA used to check both of them, even if it didn't need to. I'm not sure if it is now. Once we delete all of our pivot caches, this would cause us a problem. So I think I might just actually experiment with that and see if that's the way it executes. Then we'll have to make another modification here, but it won't be too bad. So now if there's more than 1 and the first one is the right size, we're just going to use the existing pivot cache. We'll refresh it. Otherwise, we'll build a new pivot cache for it. Either way, by the time we come out of this if statement, PC is going to be pointing at our pivot cache. All right, I'm going to go ahead and run this code and see if that does kind of what I expected it to do. So let me go ahead and here and get my count again, because the way we're going to tell is, does this change the number of pivot tables or pivot caches that we have? So right now we've got 3 pivot caches. I'm going to run this code again. Looks like it built my pivot table just fine. And cross my fingers that this gives us a 3 still, and it does. So rather than building a new pivot cache for here, it's just using one of those existing pivot caches. That's good. Were you clapping? Oh, you were flexing your fingers. Oh, I thought that was like a little tacit clap. Hey, Professor Allen, that was a really good example. Well, we're not really sure if it's a good example until we find out if it crashes once we get rid of all of our pivot caches. So I'm going to come back and delete all of my pivot tables. And that should, Excel's smart enough to say, oh, you've got a pivot cache with no pivot tables bound onto it. It'll get rid of pivot cache as well. So I think at this point, our pivot cache should be 0. So now I'm curious to see if we're going to fail at this point. The reason it would fail is that we're going to say, hey, it's not greater than 0. But the question is it going to check still try to check the first pivot cache. Is there a number one pivot cache at this point? No, so this will fail if VBA actually gets to try to check this expression, and I'm not sure if it does. So let me put a breakpoint here, we'll run to here, and I'll go one statement. Yeah, fails. So kind of unnecessarily, VBA is checking to see if, if this expression is true. So rather than put this as an and, I'm going to nest it. And hopefully, if it's greater than 0, this is the whole thing I was trying to get past in the first place. So we won't actually check this expression unless it's greater than 0. Yeah, and I think I'm going to have to duplicate the code in here as well. Kind of back to where we were. It's a good thing you didn't actually clap for me because we really haven't improved anything here. But for now, let's just go ahead and leave it duplicated. What we might end up doing is like just setting. Oh, I just thought of how to do it. Okay, so I'm just going to have this as a separate if statement. So we're saying, not quite. Oh yeah, there it is. Whew. All right, so it's still a nested if. We're going to check first to see if there's more than one pivot cache. If there's more than one pivot cache, and if it looks like we've got the right number of rows, we're going to go ahead and bind onto that pivot cache. If we have bound onto this pivot cache, in fact, before we bind onto this pivot cache, then PC is not bound onto anything. So if we get through this code and we haven't yet bound PC on to anything, then it's time to run this code. Let me go ahead and kind of run this. And before we do any binding, let me see what PC is. I think this is going to evaluate to type name. Right. So as with any object variable, before it's bound onto something, before it's bound onto an object, it's actually bound onto a special object called nothing. So I can, it's the only object that has neither properties nor methods. It's just an object. So I can use that to tell if the object variable is bound onto anything. So now I'm going to come here and say if PC is nothing. And when you're checking for equality between two objects, you use the keyword is, then we got to bind onto it. So this is a better way to do this because now we only have our code for actually creating the new pivot cache in here once. So we should now be able to execute through this. It's not greater than 0. PC is nothing, so we should come in here and bind that on. And that should run and build the pivot table, which we can see that it did in the background here. Okay, questions? All right, I'd like to do a couple more things then with this. Yes, go ahead.
But my source type, like from the very beginning, has been external, external.
Oh, really? So you're not Excel database? Is your code failing?
So then I did the whole thing again.
Still the same thing?
Still, that's external.
What happens if you just try to change it to Excel database?
Well, it has like other parts that I did, I think because it's external.
So yeah, we'll take a look after class. All right, so let me come back over here to my newly created pivot table. And I think what I'd like to do is, let's suppose that the report that we're kind of preparing for here is we've got some kind of group of colleges in the Intermountain West that we're kind of get together and we talk about, crime, a lot of things. Comes up on the agenda once a year as we talk about kind of what crime is happening on campus in our various, colleges in the region. And so I think what I'd like to do is I would like to set this filter to only show like Colorado, Wyoming, Arizona, Utah. Maybe New Mexico as well. And so I'm just going to record myself setting that filter. So I'll drop down this list, won't select all, and let's take those 5 states. Colorado, what do you say, Arizona? Remember Utah, Wyoming, there's one more. Oh, New Mexico. And maybe in particular, I'm interested in, we're here in Utah, so I want to start off with Utah expanded. So this is how I'd like that pivot table to begin. Let's take a look at the code that generated and see what it leaves us to do. Okay, and this is really a little bit ugly. So it looks like the way that we hide those is by, well, let's go ahead and I'm gonna bring this up. So I'm just gonna kind of end my prior macro, not end my prior macro, not begin this one. So I'll just kind of merge the code in here. Now the problem here is that we're setting all of these to false, except the ones that we want to have selected. That's pretty ugly. So in fact, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to set them all to false. And then we'll use a loop to do that. And then we'll set the specific individual ones back to true that we want. All right, so we just kind of get one of these lines by itself kind of isolated from the width. So again, here I'm going to refer to my pivot table with my PT variable. And let me just check with this. So my guess is that this is a collection. So I should be able, if that's true, I should be able to get the count. Oh, except I'm not currently running. So let me go ahead and bring in the full expression just as I'm testing this. We won't know what PT is unless I'm in break mode. All right, so that's telling me that there's 44. And we took off 5. Well, that's right. So that would mean there's 48 to begin with. Seems like there should be one more, but or one fewer. But that's good. That lets me know that I can refer to this by an index instead of by its name, as we're doing down here. So I should be able to say pivot item sub 1, and it can always ask for the type of something. Just let us know if it can evaluate my expression. So yeah, I can go after this numerically, or I could do it with a for each statement. So I want to go ahead and do it that way. I'll just declare a local variable here. And this is a pivot item. So let me dim pivot item. I'll just call it PI, pivot item, as a pivot item. Then we'll say for each PI in some collection, which is going to be this. Remember that the for each loop takes an object variable and it binds it on to each element in this collection one at a time as we go through. So now I should be able to say PI dot visible equals false. I'm not entirely sure that I'm going to be allowed to set every single one to false. So I've got a nagging feeling that's telling me if I try to run this, it'll get to delete the last one. It'll give me an error that says, hey, you can't make the last one invisible. So rather than setting them all to invisible and then setting the ones that I want, I'm just going to check to see if the value that I'm looking for is, if it's in one of my sets. So let's just do the in string for that. If in string, I'm going to look at some set of values that I supply, and I want to know probably the name. It's probably a property called name. Yeah, I can ask for the name of that pivot item, and I want to know if the name is in that set. So let's see, start at 1. We're going to be looking for Utah, New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming. W, and Arizona. And we're looking at PI.name. So if the name of the pivot item is in the set, actually, we don't know if it's not in the set. So if this is equal to 0, remember, in string returns the position at which it finds one string inside the other. And so if I'm looking, if I'm looking at the name of one of these pivot items, I'm checking to see if that name is in this set. If it's in this set, then this expression will return where it finds one in the other. If it's not there, it returns 0. And so this expression says that the name of the pivot item is not in the set that I have here. I'm not sure why I put commas in there. I don't even really need the spaces, but the spaces will make it a little bit more readable for me. So I'm just looking at this name and asking it, is it in this string? And if it's not, then we're going to set it to false. Thank you.
Question on that.
Yeah.
The new being where it is, that also bring up like.
Yeah, that's right. If there was just a state called Mexico, then we'd pick that one up by mistake. We'd have to do something a little more sophisticated. But I don't think we have any states that are subsets of other states. So if we had a state called Jersey, we'd have to worry about New Jersey.
Oh, there's a new.
That's what I'm saying, new.
Right, but so let's look at New Jersey. So I'm asking, is New Jersey found in this string? And the answer is no. Right, because this will be the full name of a state. And we're checking to see, does that show up in here? So yeah, the new part is in that, but New Jersey won't be in here. Right? And if it was, if we did have a state that was whose name was fully inside another state's name, like if we had Carolina and North Carolina, that would be a problem. And then we'd have to do something a little more sophisticated with the string. It wouldn't be too bad, but because we don't have that situation, I don't think there's any reason to do it. No, you got it. You're right. Virginia and West Virginia. Oh. Well, since we're dealing with these 5 states for now, that'll be okay. But yeah, we could do something to put, right, a space on each side. No, we'd have to put something else to kind of make those as delimiters and then check for those on both sides. So right, if we decided we want to highlight either Virginia or West Virginia, I have to think about which one would be the problem. Then we'd have to do this in a little more sophisticated way. But that's going to get rid of this with statement that we have here. So we're doing that same thing with that loop. Oh, it looked like it actually split this. It was like too long. The with statement was like too busy, so it made it into 2 with statements. I don't think we have to select the range here. And then again here, we'll change this to PT, and we're just setting Utah to show detail. It looks like it did that without error. And it built, let's see, 7, I think is the one I practiced with, yeah. And it built 8 exactly the same way. So that really is everything I wanted to show you about working with pivot tables. How unusual that we should be done almost 15 minutes early. So we've got time if there's any questions. You want to kind of explore something else in the pivot table, in this pivot table, how would you code that? We could poke around at it. And right now everyone's going, no one say anything, and we're out of here.
Can I just see your code following it?
Yeah. All right. If that's it, then class dismissed. Thanks for coming. I'll see you next Monday.